October 15, 1948, Grace Episcopal Church, Grand Rapids, Michigan. Guests filled the pews. The ceremony sat ready to begin, and the bride, a former professional dancer named Betty, stood watching for a groom who had not arrived. No traffic jam held him up, and no case of cold feet kept him hiding in a parking lot. Gerald Ford arrived late to his own wedding because campaigning for a seat in Congress swallowed his morning, which means he weighed the two obligations on his calendar and picked the voters. Take a second with that image, because it quietly predicts the next 30 years of this marriage. Voters came first on the wedding day, and voters kept coming first for decades, through every campaign that followed and every rung of the Washington ladder he climbed. The arrangement never changed, and Betty simply signed it without reading the fine print. 26 years later, that same man raised his right hand and became President of the United States in the wreckage of Watergate, and that same bride turned into the most talked about First Lady of her generation. America adored them. After the secrecy and paranoia of the Nixon years, the Fords looked almost suspiciously normal, a husband and wife who held hands in public and behaved like recognizable human beings inside a building that tends to turn its residents into wax figures. That warm picture stuck, and it still shapes how most people remember them. It also leaves out most of the story, which is a problem, because the missing parts are the ones worth telling. Behind the hand-holding sat a marriage arranged around political mathematics from the very first date. A wife who spent decades functionally alone while her husband chased power across the country, a slow-building dependency on alcohol and prescription painkillers, and a family confrontation in 1978, so raw that the woman at its center later admitted she felt furious and terrified at the same time. This is the story of Gerald and Betty Ford, a couple sold to America as simple and wholesome, whose marriage turned out to be one of the most complicated partnerships in modern political history. It survived ambition, isolation, chronic pain, a scandal-stained presidency, a television interview that allegedly cost 20 million votes, and an addiction crisis that nearly swallowed everything the two of them built. Then it produced a rehab clinic, because history carries a strange sense of humor. To understand how a campaign schedule wedding led to all of that, you have to rewind to Grand Rapids in August 1947, where a 29-year-old department store employee with a complicated personal life met a 35-year-old lawyer with a secret. Neither of them saw the next 30 years coming, and honestly, nobody could have. Start with the version everyone knows. On August 9th, 1974, Richard Nixon resigned in disgrace. Gerald Ford took the oath of office, and America suddenly found itself with a presidential couple that not one citizen had voted into the White House. A country exhausted by tapes, subpoenas, lawyers, and lies wanted something human to look at. The Fords delivered. Where earlier administrations kept presidential marriages carefully staged and emotionally bolted shut, Gerald and Betty touched each other in public, teased each other in front of cameras, and radiated a warmth that is very hard to fake for long on national television. Reporters noticed, so did the public, and decades later, biographers still describe the bond between them with phrases like unquantifiable chemistry, which is not the kind of language historians usually hand out for free. And none of it came from acting. That distinction turns this story strange rather than cynical, because by basically every account that exists, including two separate memoirs, these two people genuinely loved each other from 1947 until the end. The complication is that genuine love shared the house with genuine damage, and for most of the marriage, only one of the two ever appeared on camera. Betty married a Grand Rapids lawyer, expecting a calm, predictable Midwestern life, and instead received a quarter-century of raising 4 children mostly alone while her husband turned into one of the most powerful Republicans in Washington, followed by chronic pain, then pills, then alcohol, all of it invisible to a public that only ever saw the smile. A political wife's job description in that era ran about 1 sentence long: look flawless, stay silent. Betty eventually tired of both halves. That gap between image and interior is the real subject here. So rewind to where the gap first opened, in a department store in western Michigan, with a woman whose life already contained more complications than the town around her preferred to discuss. In August 1947, Elizabeth Ann Bloomer Warren, 29 years old, worked as a fashion coordinator at a department store in Grand Rapids, Michigan. A job that does not sound like the origin story of a woman who would one day rattle an entire political party on live television. Her resume ran wider than the job title, though. Before the department store, she had danced with Martha Graham's company, a credential that in the 1940s Midwest read as somewhere between glamorous and mildly alarming, depending on which church your neighbors attended. Betty also arrived with a detail guaranteed to give political advisors night sweats, a collapsing first marriage. She lived separated from a man named William Warren and had already decided to seek a divorce, a word that in 1947 carried a social weight genuinely hard to explain to a modern audience. Then life intervened cruelly. Warren fell into a severe diabetic coma. Think about her options at that moment. She could have handed the crisis to his family and continued with the divorce, and honestly, few people would have judged her for it. Instead, she stayed and nursed the man she fully intended to leave through his entire recovery, and only once he recovered did she finalize the divorce in December 1947. Remember that instinct. When someone near Betty fell apart, she absorbed the cost herself, quietly, no matter the damage to her own plans, and that instinct will come back to haunt this story in a much darker form. Enter Gerald Ford, 35, Yale-educated lawyer, Navy veteran, and a man quietly assembling his first run for Congress, which happens to be the part he kept quiet. On paper, he looked like the safest possible date in Western Michigan. In practice, he came attached to an ambition so large that it would eventually reorganize both of their lives around itself, and he had already started arranging decisions around it. The courtship that followed ran on two separate tracks. Track 1 held an actual romance between two adults who clearly liked each other, and by every later account, never really stopped liking each other. Track 2 held a political risk assessment because Gerald and his advisors had studied their conservative Midwestern electorate and concluded that a candidate marrying a divorced former dancer might scare off exactly the voters he needed most. Their solution tells you plenty about the groom. Keep the engagement quiet and delay the wedding until the primary landed safely in his column. At one point, Gerald reportedly told Betty that he wanted to marry her in the fall, but could not explain why the timing mattered, because the congressional run itself remained a secret. Sit with the romance of that proposal for a second. Marry me, on a date determined by factors I declined to reveal. She agreed anyway, which either proves his charm or her confidence in handling whatever he kept hidden. And to be fair, both readings would age interestingly. Ford won his primary, the engagement could finally exist in public, and the wedding landed on October 15, 1948, square in the middle of the general election campaign, because apparently even the wedding date needed to clear the political calendar first. Grace Episcopal Church in Grand Rapids hosted the ceremony. The groom, predictably, arrived late. On account of campaigning for the seat, he wanted more than punctuality. The honeymoon somehow managed to top the lateness. Rather than a quiet week somewhere warm, the newlyweds attended a University of Michigan versus Northwestern football game and then a rally for Thomas Dewey, the Republican presidential candidate that year. A former Martha Graham dancer spent her honeymoon in a football stadium and at a campaign event. Take that in, and then consider that nobody involved seems to have found it strange, which tells you exactly what kind of marriage lay ahead. Every marriage teaches its lessons early, and this one taught with unusual clarity. Before the ink dried on the guest book, Betty had learned that her private milestones would share billing with her husband's public ambitions, and that the sharing would rarely run 50-50. The wedding waited on a primary while the honeymoon doubled as a campaign stop. Anyone hunting for the roots of the next 30 years can stop hunting right here in October 1948 at a football stadium standing in for a romantic getaway. On November 2, less than 3 weeks after the vows, Gerald won his seat, and the couple immediately packed up and moved to Washington, D.C., meaning the first month of this marriage ran primary, wedding, campaign, election, relocation, in that exact order of priority. The sequence lacked subtlety. Betty officially found herself married to a congressman, though she still believed, reasonably enough, that she had married a Grand Rapids lawyer who would one day retire into a calm and predictable life back home. To be fair to Gerald, he never hid the ambition itself from her, apart from the one time he hid an entire congressional campaign from her. She knew he wanted things. What she could not have priced in, where she would rank in the schedule once the wanting started paying off, and the full answer to that question would take roughly 25 years and one medical crisis to arrive. Hold Betty's expectation in view, because everything painful in the next 2 decades grows directly out of it. She counted on marrying a lawyer who would eventually retire to a quiet, predictable existence in Grand Rapids, a belief that fit the facts of 1948 perfectly, and then aged about as badly as any belief can age. Washington rewrote the plan, and so did her husband. Gerald turned out to be very good at congressional politics, and very good is a dangerous thing to be in that building, because the reward for winning in Washington is always more Washington. His career climbed year after year until he reached House Minority Leader, one of the most powerful Republican positions in the country, a job fueled by relentless ambition and near constant travel. And the travel never stopped. Whatever the party needed, Wherever the party needed it, Gerald showed up, and the calendar of a minority leader leaves little white space for a family. Back home, the arithmetic stayed brutally simple. 4 children arrived over those years: Michael, Jack, Stephen, and Susan, and their father remained, structurally speaking, somewhere else. Betty became what historians politely call a de facto single parent, which is a diplomatic way of describing a woman running an entire household alone while technically married to one of the most famous politicians in America. Every scraped knee, every school problem, every report card, every long evening belonged to her, while the man whose name sat on the mailbox belonged to the Republican Party. And parenting covered only half the workload. Political wifehood came with its own grueling job description: the appearances, the entertaining, the constant requirement to represent a husband currently somewhere over Ohio, and Betty carried all of it on top of raising 4 children practically solo. The 2 jobs fed on the same person. Neither one came with backup, and the man who might have supplied some stayed busy becoming indispensable to everyone in Washington except the people at his own address. Historian John Robert Greene later put a sharp edge on this stretch of the marriage, arguing that Gerald's career did not merely happen to leave Betty lonely, but actively pushed her toward isolation year after year, mile after mile. The gap kept widening. She had agreed to a lawyer in Grand Rapids and ended up living with a national political operation that happened to share her last name, and no one ever invited her to vote on the change. None of this looked like a crisis from the outside, which is part of what let it grow so dangerous. Political wives of that era faced an expectation to appear flawless and stay agreeable, a job with no sick days and no complaints department, and the whole culture around Congress treated a smiling, silent spouse as standard equipment. Betty performed the role. The cost of the performance stayed off the books for years, accumulating quietly the way interest does, and nobody in Washington ran the audit. Then her body started sending invoices. A pinched nerve arrived first, followed by osteoarthritis, and together they settled into the kind of chronic pain that reshapes a person's entire day, every single day, with no finish line anywhere in sight. Pain like that does not simply hurt, it grinds, and it grinds hardest on someone already carrying a household alone. Doctors supplied prescription painkillers for the physical agony, and alcohol quietly volunteered for everything the pills could not reach: the pressure, the loneliness, the empty evenings, the years of being the only adult in the room. Alcohol dulled the isolation, while pills dulled the pain. Together they dulled everything else too, slowly enough that nobody around her ever needed to name the thing unfolding in front of them. Nobody should picture a dramatic spiral here, either, because the era's whole design prevented drama. The dependency grew inside a life that stayed outwardly functional. Children raised, events attended, checkbooks balanced, photographs smiled for, which is exactly how a problem survives for decades without ever earning a name. Functioning hid the damage. The better Betty performed, the less reason anyone found to look closer, and her entire adult life had drilled her in exactly that skill. This continued for decades. Not months, not one rough patch, decades, hidden behind a public image that political culture demanded stay spotless at all times. 2 forces kept the problem invisible, and they locked together neatly. The era required perfect wives, so admitting a dependency felt unthinkable, and Gerald's workaholism kept the one person best positioned to notice away from home too often to notice, a combination that worked like a door with 2 locks, both of them turned. And remember Betty's pattern from 1947. When people around her struggled, she absorbed the cost quietly and kept moving, which is an admirable trait right up until the person struggling is you. Nobody nursed the nurse, and for decades nobody seems to have registered that she needed one. The woman who once stayed to care for a husband she planned to divorce now applied the same discipline to hiding her own decline, and she hid it, unfortunately, very well. History then played its wild card. On August 9th, 1974, Richard Nixon resigned the presidency under the weight of Watergate, and Gerald Ford, who had never once run in a national election, took the oath of office as President of the United States. Betty became First Lady the same day, and nobody in America had voted for either outcome. The country they inherited sat exhausted and cynical, freshly burned by its own government, the perfect audience for the Ford's particular brand of unpolished warmth. Where previous administrations kept marital affection carefully off camera, Gerald and Betty put it front and center, holding hands, teasing each other, showing real tenderness, behaving like a couple rather than a portrait. It worked. A country that had just watched its president lie to it on television found the sight of 2 people who obviously liked each other weirdly reassuring, and the contrast with the past did half the work. Betty stepped into the First Lady role the same way her husband stepped into the presidency, with no campaign, no transition plan, and no mandate beyond not being the previous occupants. For a woman who had spent decades performing quiet perfection, the promotion could have simply meant a bigger stage for the same silent act. Washington assumed the act would continue, an assumption that survived almost exactly 1 year. Just one complication came with installing Betty Ford as a comforting national symbol. After 25 years of smiling and staying quiet, she carried absolutely no intention of continuing to stay quiet. And the White House would soon discover exactly how much opinion had accumulated behind that famous smile. The storage unit sat full, and somebody had just handed her a microphone. August 10, 1975. 1 year and 1 day into the Ford presidency, Betty sat down with CBS's 60 Minutes for an interview that would detonate across American politics, and nobody in the room seems to have braced for the blast radius. Her remarks sound fairly tame now, but in 1975 they read like heresy broadcast directly from inside the White House. 4 bombshells, 1 broadcast. She told a national audience that her children had probably tried marijuana and added that she would not be surprised if her teenage daughter began an affair. Her own psychiatric treatment came up too, discussed openly at a moment when political culture treated therapy as a shameful secret. Then came the finale, in which the sitting First Lady of a Republican administration called the Supreme Court's Roe v. Wade ruling a great, great decision. First Ladies did not talk like this. In fact, the role barely permitted talking at all, which had functioned as the entire operating manual since roughly forever, and Betty had just fed that manual into a shredder on national television. Conservative voters erupted. The backlash rolled in fast and furious, aimed at a Republican White House that could not afford to lose its own base, and the woman responsible planned to walk exactly nothing back. Gerald's reaction remains one of the great husband responses in presidential history. Watching the broadcast together, he threw a pillow at her and joked that her remarks had just cost him 10 million votes. Then, after reading the full transcripts, revised the estimate upward to 20 million. Catch the detail buried inside that joke, though. He threw a pillow, not a fit, and behind closed doors he kept supporting her, even as her honesty handed his political enemies free ammunition by the crate. The 60 Minutes fallout also exposed the strange double life this marriage now led. In private, the interview produced a thrown pillow and a running joke about vote totals, the kind of teasing that only works between 2 people who fundamentally trust each other. In public, it produced a genuine political headache for a Republican president whose party's conservative wing already resented the First Lady. Same interview, 2 marriages watching it, and only one of them laughed. Nor did the interview turn out to be a one-off malfunction, because Betty kept going. Her advocacy for the Equal Rights Amendment ran tireless and loud, and every speech pushed her deeper into open conflict with the Republican Party's conservative wing, the exact faction her husband could least afford to anger. Consider the position that put Gerald in. His wife's honesty strained his party, and his party's anger strained his presidency. He backed her anyway, privately and consistently, while the political bill kept growing, which suggests that somewhere under all that ambition sat a man who actually meant the vows he showed up late for. Historian John Robert Greene later argued that Betty's candor forced the entire country to redraw the boundaries of what public discourse could contain, and to rethink what a presidential spouse even existed for. That is a large legacy for one interview and a few speeches. It also turned out to be a preview, because the biggest act of public honesty in Betty Ford's life had not happened yet, and the road to it ran through the worst chapter of the marriage. The Ford presidency ended, and the couple swapped Washington for Rancho Mirage, California, the pressure cooker for desert sun, which sounds like the opening of a peaceful retirement chapter. The chapter refused to cooperate. By the time the Fords settled into California life, Betty's dependency on alcohol and prescription painkillers had reached a genuine crisis point. Decades of quiet accumulation finally coming due, with no state dinners left to dress for and no press corps left to perform composure for. Understand what a crisis point means after that many years. This ran deeper than a bad month or an embarrassing party, a dependency that had grown since the congressional years, hardened by chronic pain and watered by loneliness, protected the entire time by the one skill Betty had mastered above all others, absorbing damage silently. The habit of hiding had held for decades, and now it failed in front of the only audience that ever really mattered, her own family. A bitter irony sits in the middle of this chapter. The woman who had shocked America with her honesty on 60 Minutes, who had discussed psychiatric treatment and her own children's private lives on national television, still could not bring herself to speak openly about the one struggle doing the most damage. Even her candor stopped at one door. Betty could tell the country almost anything except the thing her family could see with their own eyes, which finally brought the Fords to the choice that families in this situation always dread: the one with no painless option anywhere on the menu. Stay silent and watch the problem deepen year after year, or confront the person you love and risk detonating every single relationship in the room all at once. For a family whose entire public identity rested on warmth and closeness, the second option carried a particular kind of terror. In April 1978, they chose it anyway. Nothing about the confrontation happened spontaneously. This took shape as a formal, planned family intervention, and the guest list tells you how seriously everyone involved treated it. Gerald attended. So did their daughter Susan, alongside Betty's doctors. And a specialist named Dr. Joseph Cruz helped steer the whole thing, a man whose background takes a sentence to explain. Cruz looks like an odd fit on paper, because his original training ran through obstetrics and gynecology, not the resume line you expect at an addiction intervention. But he had turned himself into an addiction specialist, co-founded a recovery series at the Eisenhower Medical Center, and his role in facilitating this intervention would prove instrumental both on that day in April 1978 and for years afterward. On paper, the gathering resembled a medical procedure, but in the room, it sat much closer to bomb disposal. Everyone understood the risk. Volatile undersells what followed. Gerald later described the fury Betty unleashed during the intervention, and Betty herself admitted to a double-layered fear. Angry at the people confronting her, while simultaneously terrified that she had turned into a political liability for her husband. Read that second fear again. 30 years into the marriage, cornered in the most painful conversation of her life, confronted about a dependency that threatened to swallow her. Part of her mind still ran the campaign arithmetic from 1948, still asking whether the divorced ex-dancer might cost the candidate votes. That fear did not appear from nowhere. A marriage that began with a hidden engagement, a poll-tested wedding date, and a honeymoon spent at a rally had taught her, from the very first month, that her personal life carried a political price tag, and apparently some part of her never stopped reading the receipt. The lesson took root 3 decades earlier and bloomed at the worst possible moment in a room full of people trying to save her life. Despite the fury and the terror, the intervention succeeded, because Betty heard it. However raw the intervention grew, something in it landed, and the fallout rearranged not just the marriage, but, eventually, the way an entire country talks about addiction. Betty admitted herself to the Long Beach Naval Hospital for treatment. Catch the phrasing. She admitted herself, walking into a military hospital as one of the most recognizable women in America, at a moment when public figures simply did not do that. And after an entire adult life spent training to hide exactly this kind of struggle, the woman who spent decades absorbing costs quietly finally handed one to the world instead. Call it arguably the bravest political act from a family full of politicians, and nobody ran it past a single handler first. Gerald, meanwhile, produced the most underrated gesture of the entire marriage. He quit drinking entirely, in solidarity with his wife, not a cutback and not a temporary show of support, but a complete stop. Weigh that against everything you have watched him do across this story. The man who arrived late to his own wedding because campaigning mattered more, whose career left Betty alone for a quarter century, whose ambition shaped every family decision since 1947, looked at his wife in crisis and finally reorganized his own life around her instead of the other way around. The crucible strengthened them. And the record backs that up, because what emerged from 1978 looked less like a wounded couple managing an embarrassment and more like a genuine partnership pointed at a shared project, one that finally gave the marriage a center of gravity belonging to both of them after 30 years of orbiting his career. The irony spreads thick enough for toast. The worst chapter of the marriage produced the version of the marriage everyone assumed they had watched all along. Recovery could have stayed a private epilogue, and honestly, nobody would have blamed them for keeping it one. A former First Lady quietly completing treatment, a supportive husband at her side, one carefully worded statement to the press, and then decades of comfortable silence in the California sunshine. The available script, pre-approved by every political handler in America. Betty chose the opposite of silence. She had already published her memoir, The Times of My Life, in 1978, the very year of the intervention, and Gerald followed with his own book, A Time to Heal, in 1979, which means this couple processed their private history in public while the wounds stayed fresh. Then came the far bigger move. In 1982, Gerald and Betty co-founded the Betty Ford Center, a treatment institution born directly out of their shared recovery, and installed as founding medical director none other than Dr. Joseph Cruz, the same man who helped steer the intervention 4 years earlier. Stop and measure the distance that name on that building traveled. A former First Lady attached her own identity permanently and publicly to addiction treatment, inside a political culture that demanded flawless wives, whispered about psychiatric care, and kept her own dependency invisible for decades precisely because admitting it felt unthinkable. Her name became the institution's front door. Within a few years, the stigma she lived under started losing ground in American life, pushed back by the simple fact that the most famous patient in the country refused shame. This is also the point where the marriage itself changed jobs. For its first 30 years, the partnership existed in service of Gerald's career, scheduled around primaries and leadership duties, packaged for voters whenever the cameras happened to swing around. After 1978, the machinery ran in reverse, with Gerald's fame and Gerald's steadiness deployed in service of Betty's cause instead. He turned her into a political calculation in 1948, she turned him into a recovery advocate in 1982, and of the two conversions, hers aged far better. The Betty Ford Center turned a private catastrophe into public infrastructure. That sentence should not parse, and yet there it is, the logical endpoint for a woman whose defining instinct always ran toward carrying other people through their worst moments, finally scaled up from one Grand Rapids sickbed in 1947 to an entire national institution. Modern biographers treat this marriage as one of the most consequential in American political history, and notably, not for its perfection. Lisa McCubbin's 2018 biography dwells on the chemistry and mutual devotion between Gerald and Betty while carefully documenting the toll his career took on her mental and physical health, refusing to let either truth cancel the other. Both truths existed at once, which is the entire point. Any account keeping only the devotion turns into a greeting card, and any account keeping only the damage misses why the marriage held. John Robert Greene's assessment cuts deeper into the mechanics. His 2004 study returns again and again to the dissonance between what Betty expected from this marriage and what Gerald's ambition actually delivered, tracing how that ambition pushed her into isolation, and he credits her candor with forcing the nation to redefine what a presidential spouse could put on the record. Follow that chain of causes for a second. The isolation fed the suffering. The suffering eventually demanded honesty, and the honesty rebuilt an American institution, which means the flaw and the legacy grew from the same root. Notice the claim missing from all of these assessments. By the way, any suggestion that the Fords faked it? Historians who happily catalog the isolation, the resentment, and the addiction still describe two people genuinely devoted to each other across the whole span, which separates this story from a standard political marriage takedown. The love held true, and so did the damage. Most famous marriages end up remembered for one or the other, and the Fords earned the stranger fate of accurate memory on both counts. Historians land on a verdict that would have horrified the image managers of 1948. This partnership matters precisely because it emerged flawed, tested, and authentic, because it survived not just the presidency, but ambition, resentment, and addiction, and because the surviving happened in public, where it could actually change something. The perfect marriage would have changed nothing, while the complicated one built a clinic. So return one last time to Grace Episcopal Church, October 15, 1948, and the bride waiting on a groom off somewhere, asking strangers for votes. Every complication that followed already existed in that scene in miniature. The ambition, the calculation, the woman expected to wait quietly while a career decided the schedule. Nobody in those pews could have predicted the ending. A couple assembled around campaign mathematics became, 3 decades later, the most disarmingly honest first family in living memory, and they arrived there through the exact suffering the campaign mathematics helped create. Betty Ford spent 30 years absorbing costs in silence, then spent the years after 1978 ensuring other people would not need to absorb theirs alone, while the husband whose ambition helped cause the damage quit drinking, stood beside her and put the family name on the repair shop. A marriage sold to voters as simple turned out complicated, and the complicated version ended up helping far more people than the simple one ever could have. Funny how that works. The fairy tale reassured a country for about 2 years, and the real story has treated patients since 1982. If you enjoyed watching a presidential marriage turn out stranger than advertised, political history overflows with stories exactly like this one. So subscribe and check out the last video while you are at it. History rarely rewards the official version, and this channel prefers the other kind.